Hi, Jade.
Yes.
Hi, Jade.
Mom, you're hearing. Yes. What happened? You got some... Right. I understand. It all just opened up.
Helen Keller once said, blindness separates us from things, but deafness separates us from people. Hearing loss affects 48 million Americans. That is 15% of the population. Most of those cases are currently untreated. In recent years, there have been breakthroughs in the treatment of hearing loss. Dr. Ingeborg Hochmair helped pioneer the development of the Cochlear Implant. The device directly stimulates the main auditory nerve that sends messages to the brain to signal hearing. She recently received the Lasker Award for her work, and she joins me this evening along with one of her patients, Max. Max received the implant at the age of 2. He is now 19 years old and about to begin college. Also joining me, a distinguished group of scientists, David Corey of Harvard University, Frank Lynn of Johns Hopkins University, Ruth Bentler of the University of Iowa, and Eric Kandel, a Nobel laureate, a professor at Columbia University, and a Howard Hughes medical investigator, and my friend. I am pleased to have all of them here. This is an important subject, and this is an important award. The Lasker Prize is considered by many one of the most, if not the most distinguished prize for science and medicine you can receive in America, and this is what you receive when you are awarded this prize. I'll ask Eric just to tell me a moment, in a sense, what the Lasker Prize means.
The Lasker Prize is, as you indicated, the most important award America gives in the biological sciences. It has 3 categories of awards: a basic science award, a clinical award, and a public service award. And it is, for the scientists, a major indicator of the likelihood of getting a Nobel Prize. Over 80 Lasker awardees have won Nobel Prizes.
You hear that?
2 general points, Charlie, that are very interesting. One is that we were so enthusiastic about the Obama initiative. And when we began to think about how to explore that more, we thought of a precedent for the Obama initiative. What is there in the history of brain biology in which improvements in technology really had a dramatic impact? There's no better precedent than what's happened in the hearing field. It's absolutely spectacular. The other point that's interesting is all 3 of the winners of the Lasker Award started off doing fundamental basic science. They then started a company. And one of the functions of the company was to help them do their science better. It supported the science that they did. So this is a beautiful example of interaction between university and biotechnology for the benefit of both. It's really a model of how this should be done.
David Corey, tell me about hearing. Explain to us how it works.
Well, there are really 3 key concepts to understand how hearing works. And one of them is that as sound is carried into the ear, it has to be converted to a vibration by very tiny cells in the inner ear. And the second key idea is that the vibration of these cells is converted to an electrical signal, which is eventually something the brain can understand. The third idea is a bit difficult, and that is to understand that each sound is actually made up of a lot of different sounds, a lot of different tones that happen simultaneously. And for the brain to understand a sound, it has to break the sound into its different parts, and then those different channels of information have to go to the brain separately.
And go ahead. And when something goes wrong, what happens?
When something goes wrong, and we might return to this later, there are a number of things that happen, and really we should return to it later. Okay. Maybe I could continue.
Okay, go ahead. Continue. You have some slides.
Yes. So, and let me show you quickly where this happens in the head. So the outer ear carries the sound into the eardrum. And then it's carried through the middle ear to finally reach the inner ear where the cochlea is. The cochlea is actually the organ that does this conversion to a neural signal. And then the auditory nerve carries that signal to the brain. Here you can see sound waves being collected by the external ear, and they're carried down the ear canal to hit the eardrum. When the sound waves hit the eardrum, it makes it vibrate. And then this vibration is carried by 3 tiny bones in the middle ear into the inner ear, where the cochlea is. The inner ear actually has organs for two different senses. On the right is the snail-shaped cochlea that gives us our sense of hearing, and those tubular structures on the left give us our sense of balance. To understand how the cochlea works, we can zoom in much more detail, and we can see that there's a special set of about 15,000 cells that do this conversion to neural signals. They're called hair cells because if we zoom in even further, you can see that each hair cell, which is about 1,000th of an inch long, has a tuft of special cilia coming from the apical surface, from the top. And then if we look even closer, we can see how the tectorial membrane, which goes over the hair cells, contacts the tip of each bundle of cilia. And when sound makes the tectorial membrane move, it moves the cilia back and forth. That generates an electrical signal in the hair cells, and then nerve impulses go to the brain. So this is kind of an interesting process, but there's still something that we don't see about the process, and that is how the vibration of the cilia actually gets converted to an electrical signal. The tip of each cilium has a couple of key elements. There's this very fine tip link that connects the tip of one cilium to the side of the next taller one. And we know now that there's a special kind of a pore with sort of a gate or a trap door that can open to let electricity flow into the cell. And if we understand exactly how the bundle moves, then we can get a sense of how this might do the conversion.
It was actually David's work that really elucidated this process to a very great degree.
So the next image would show what happens when sound bends these bundles. A movement of the bundle to the left, in this case, would stretch the tip links, and that would pull the gates of the pores open, and then electric charges, I've drawn them as little yellow dots here, would be able to move into the cell, and then they make the inside of the cell more positive, the voltage changes. And so then this voltage change is converted to nerve impulses, and that's really the magic of the conversion of a vibration to a nerve impulse. So the third thing that is really special about the way the ear works is when a violin plays, or a bird sings, or a child cries, it's really not just one sound, but it's a lot of different sounds that all happen at the same time, and they're changing. And for the brain, say, to distinguish a violin from a child's cry, it has to be able to pick apart all the separate sounds and then listen to them separately. And that process, the separation into different frequencies, is also carried out by the cochlea. Basically, the cochlea gets sound all at the same time, but different parts of the cochlea are activated by different sounds. And here you can see one low-pitch sound activates one area, a higher pitch another area, and the nerve fibers that are attached to that area then send the information to the brain. Or if you played several tones at the same time, like a chord, here you could see that several nerve fibers are activated all at the same time. So the cochlea does this separation into different frequencies, and that is the essential thing that the cochlear implant also has to do if it's to replace the function of the cochlea.
So, how did you get involved in the cochlear implant?
It all started quite a long time ago, and there were prior activities in the cochlear implant field, so I'm kind of the second generation
Yes.
of cochlear implant researcher and developer. And I had a big interest in helping people through technology from when I was 13 years old.
But tell me more.
How the cochlear implant started? Well, it started really with activities in the late 50s and early 60s in France and in California. And at that time, research was done, and then like single-wire devices were used that gave people an aid to lip reading, but didn't lead to open set speech understanding without lip reading. And afterwards,
just stimulating single pathways.
Yes,
very much like he was showing before.
Yeah. So in the late 70s, the multi-channel implant came along, and it was first implanted in 77 in Vienna, Austria, and in Australia a little later. And the other award winner is Graham Clark from Melbourne University. And in the beginning, with these multi-channel devices, there were some pioneer patients who spent hours and weeks in the lab to help us with psychophysical experiments to find out which signals we should send to the contacts of the electrodes. And then in 1980, the first patient by the name of Connie, all of a sudden, because we had changed the way the signal that was sent to the electrodes, understood sentences and words without lip reading, and it was right on the birthday of her brother, who had also gone deaf like her. And so at that point in time, we knew it worked. We just had to make it available for many, many people, and that took many years. And in the early 90s, the third Lasker Award winner, Blake Wilson, published a speech coding strategy, how to encode the signal from the microphone, that brought another step in performance, big increase in performance, and made the speech perception more robust to a noise. And since then, further improvements have taken place. And the cochlear implant has the advantage that it really doesn't need a loudspeaker in the ear canal. And that's why we were able and are able to improve things in terms of how they blend into everyday life for the users. Right now there is even a processor that doesn't have to sit on the ear because we don't need a loudspeaker in the ear canal. It can be off the ear and not in conflict with glasses even. So a cochlear implant consists of two components, an external audio processor and an implant. And the implant is surgically placed, and then afterwards the surgeon inserts a long, flexible electrode into the snail-shaped cochlear. And that's done to be able to restore a wide frequency range, because each of these electrodes stimulate a different part of the cochlea. Then sound comes into the audio processor, is transmitted through the intact skin to the implant, and then small electrical impulses are generated that stimulate the auditory nerve. And thus the function of the inner ear is bypassed because these hair cells don't function anymore.
This is so remarkable, because this is the first example in which any sensory organ can completely be substituted for. It's absolutely extraordinary.
Yes.
Go ahead.
And what we're going to see now is very special, because after the implantation, a few weeks later, there's a switch on of the audio processor. And we're going to see this on a little child who has never heard before in his life, who has not heard his mother's voice.
Hey, good job.
You back on.
I know.
Hi, Cooper. Hi, Cooper.
Hi, Cooper. Listen. Hi, Cooper.
Wow.
One
quite
out
a
of
special
every
moment.
400 children is born deaf. That's just amazing.
It is. And what, is there a figure worldwide in terms of how many children each year are born deaf?
Yes, each year there are 134 million children born, and
With some
one
hearing
in
deficiency
1,000
or deaf?
in total, and 1 in 1,000 of those has a real hearing deficit that could be helped with a cochlear implant.
Max, I want to turn to you, and this obviously helped you.
Yes, it helped me a lot.
Tell me what it meant to you.
Well, I couldn't tell this to you exactly because I've got my first implant with 2 years. And so I learned my life with hearing. I mean, with 2 years, you don't really realize your life. You don't save it. And so I have a usual life. I went to school and to kindergarten, of course. And as you said, I'm going to go to university now. And as I said, it's a usual life for me. And I think without this implant, I would I don't know exactly where I would be now, but it would be completely other life, and I would have to learn sign language, and I would have it really, really much harder, of course, because I don't know exactly if you can imagine how it is if you don't hear anything.
Yeah.
What is so wonderful about the cochlear implant, as we see with Max, is he doesn't have to do any lip reading. He doesn't need any visual cues. He hears like you and I do.
Yeah. And how long does it take to train?
I don't know exactly. Of course, well, I got my first implant with 2 years. That was really, really close, because I think with 2 years it's really late for a child to start learning language, because with 5 years it's too late. It's not really too late, but after 5 years it's really late, so they have it's very hard for them. But for me, with 2 years, it was okay. So I got to a normal kindergarten and a normal school, and I learned it really fast because I've had normal language around me.
So, Charlie, this is remarkable because, I mean, what Mac's expressing is that he basically just had a normal childhood growing up. And you need to take that in the context of how it used to be before cochlear implantation, when children who were born deaf, and about 90% of children born deaf were born to hearing parents. They used to be routinely sent to a residential school to learn sign language. So their entire life, for many of these kids, they couldn't even communicate with their own parents unless their parents could also learn sign language. And it was a point where if you don't really develop verbal language early on, that we saw even just 20 years ago that the average 18-year-old child learning American Sign Language, they only read at the 4th or 5th grade level, right? And that's mainly because that ability to speak and understand, it sets the foundation for being able to read and write. And you can imagine literacy is such an important skill for a foundation of the rest of your life. So what's Max saying now, that going to just a mainstream school like any other kid is just absolutely remarkable, because it was completely different just 20 or 30 years ago.
The revolution treatment of hearing disorders in the last 20 years is remarkable. It's really like a war on deafness, and amazingly successful.
Tell me about the elderly.
So, you know, the amazing thing about hearing loss in older adults is just basically how common it is. You know, if we look across the lifespan, you see that the prevalence, how common a significant hearing loss is, it basically doubles with every age, decade of your life. Right? So basically what that means is by the time we look at people who are above 70 years old, that nearly 2/3, 2 of every 3 people over 70 has a clinically significant hearing loss. And because that, in a way, it used to be seen that, well, if it's so common, you know, how could it be important? It's just got to be, you know, unfortunate but inconsequential part of aging. And increasingly, just over the last 2 or 3 years now, we're realizing that that's completely not the case. We're seeing that people who have just even a bread and butter age-related loss, like all of us will have as we age, it quintuples your risk of dementia in some cases, from a 2 to 5-fold increased risk of dementia. It increases your risk of progressing to disability and requiring institutionalization. And we're realizing that this is probably through direct effects of hearing loss. Either the most intuitive idea is that, you know, hearing loss, it contributes in some way, shape, or form to social isolation. And yet the amazing thing about that is that if we believe that hearing loss contributes to some loss of social engagement, I mean, that's fundamentally something profound. I mean, going back over 100 years now since the time of Durkheim's work, is we know now that social isolation is one of the main determinants of morbidity and mortality as we age. That pathway exists through social isolation. We also know that hearing loss, it leads to a load on the brain. Namely, as David explained before, if the brain is constantly receiving this very, very degraded auditory message from the ear, the brain really needs to really rededicate processing resources to constantly deal with that very impoverished sound. So it constantly puts a load on the brain, right? The third idea through which hearing loss directly affects these outcomes in later life is that we see now that hearing loss can actually lead to changes in the brain, namely parts of the brain that are important for language and speech processing, but are also important for memory, that if it's constantly faced with a very impoverished auditory signal coming from the ear, is you literally see parts of the brain begin atrophying faster as we develop hearing loss.
All right, let me turn, Ruth Bentler, to hearing aids. Tell me how they work.
Well, in fact, we have had hearing aids around since the beginning of time, I imagine, in that people have done since the beginning of time, and probably in the 1800s more than prior to that. We had the so-called ear trumpet. This particular picture is of a typical ear horn, ear trumpet, and was David's mother speaking to her grandfather. So the grandfather in this case has the hearing loss. So we have no electronics, I'd like to point out here, but rather a way by way of speaking tube just to get the signal up to the ear. If you go to the next slide, you see a whole collection of Beethoven's ear trumpets or ear horns. So again, before we got into the age of electronics, we had some choices in terms of that collecting of sound like I showed you in the beginning we've been doing, but collecting it into a device and bringing it to the ear. Fortunately, beginning about 1901, we started having access to electronic hearing aids. And in reality, those first electronic hearing aids were nearly as big as this table, and eventually they got more smaller size and so on. We went to body style aids in the 40s, 50s, into ear level aids by 60s at least. And these days, hearing aids are pretty excellent, I would like to point out, to be positive here before we look at how a hearing aid works. All hearing aids, even since the beginning of electronic hearing aids at the turn of that century, all hearing aids had to have a place to pick up the sound, that microphone. They had to have something to amplify the sound so it would be louder. And then the sound was fed by these tiny little loud speakers into the ear canal. And basically that's still the style or the makeup of a hearing aid. Again, because we have had so much changes in technology in the last 10 years or so, that amplifier you see there is now a little electronic chip. And as I oftentimes point out to patients, that electronic chip is a computer sitting up at the ear. So it can analyze sound, it can determine what will be the amount of amplified sound coming out and so on. Again, we have accomplished what many of our persons with hearing loss hope us to accomplish, and that is to make them less obvious. Yes. And that's kind of a thing we fight in this country, I think, more than in some countries of the world. And technologically, we've come a long ways. Hearing aids have signal processing schemes that are pretty advanced. There are noise reduction schemes that happen digitally. There are microphones that come off and on and so on. And as you alluded to earlier, Charlie, and you alluded to, Frank, most of the people with hearing loss in this country can't use a cochlear implant. So their choice is to either seek no help or seek help via a hearing aid. And unfortunately for us, I guess only about 25% of those people who could use and should use a hearing aid are doing so. But
and why is that? Because of vanity or something else?
A variety of reasons. That's part of what my research has been looking into. Why do people reject hearing aids? But vanity is a big one. Cost has always been a big one. But I would say probably the bigger reason for rejection might be because people who seek hearing aids want those hearing aids to help them in difficult listening situations, and that means noise in the background. And hearing aids in a background of noise, hearing impairment in a background of noise is difficult at best. And so we still don't have a way with that particular design of hearing aid to make hearing in a background of noise easy, better, and all of the above. So in terms of technological advances, I would say that maybe our newest advantage in hearing aid has to do with all of the wireless connectivity we have available. So even as we are wired here, it is a wireless connectivity. We're wearing a microphone, but it's being projected to some receiver somewhere. That is an option for people with their hearing aids. Hearing aids now, because there's a chip in each one, can kind of talk to each other and can kind of take in information from a computer, from a TV, can hear a speaker or a talker who happens to be leading a discussion or leading a church service or whatever, because wirelessly the talker's voice can be projected to the hearing aid.
İnternette telefon parayla 500, parayla 400 lira. Aylık toplam 500 liraya kadar olan internet alışverişlerinizi Enkart'ta yapın. %20'sini bir ay içerisinde geri alın. Şube yok, masraf yok. O bakımdan fırsatı çok. Enpara.com.
Opet bu ülkede herkesin gönlünde. Üstelik tam 8 sene üst üste. Seni sevdiğimiz kadar bizi sevdiğin için teşekkürler Türkiye.
arkayı görmenizi sağlayan gizli geri görüş kamerası. Hyundai i30. Parlak fikirler bir araya geldi, ona hayat verdi. Hyundai i30 şimdi 49.300 TL'den başlayan fiyatlar ve %0.77'den başlayan faiz oranıyla.
Lüksün ışıltısı ve ardına kadar açılan kapılar. Çekim gücü yüksek bir yaşam. Baş döndüren kışkırtıcı arzular. Bu ihtişamın yıldızı sensin. Kültür, sanat ve modanın büyüleyici birlikteliğiyle beklentilerin çok üstünde sıra dışı bir yaşam tam karşında senin olmak için bekliyor. Kuasar. Yaşam bazen hayallerin ötesine geçer.